September 20th, 1944. Dawn over the fields of Arracourt. Fog drifts low across the French countryside, soft enough to hide an army and thin enough to get men killed. The battle for Lorraine is entering its deadliest phase. German Panthers, lurking behind the mist, are gutting American armor at ranges where the Shermans can't even see them. Tank crews speak in quiet voices now. 41 U.S. tanks lost in 3 weeks. 41 families who will soon receive telegrams. In the middle of this disaster stands a plane that officially isn't even a weapon, the Piper L-4 Grasshopper. Built of canvas, plywood, and hope, the L is meant to observe artillery, nothing more. Every manual says the same thing. Unarmed, unarmored, avoid contact with the enemy at all costs. Its top speed barely reaches 85 miles per hour. A heart's knees could blow it off course. And yet, this fragile airplane is about to become the most terrifying anti-tank weapon the Germans will face at Arracourt. Because inside the hangar, Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, an artillery officer with a stubborn streak and a reputation for reckless ingenuity, has lost his patience. He has watched too many tankers die. He has studied the terrain the way only a spotter pilot can, from treetop height, from the sky, and from the edge of every battlefield where the smoke rises first. Now, crouched beneath the wing of his Grasshopper, Carpenter holds a tool the manuals never mention for pilots, a welding torch. He straps on 6 M9 bazookas, 3 on each wing strut, and acts so unauthorized that any sane officer would shut it down instantly. But sanity is a luxury Arracourt no longer has. Carpenter believes something the textbooks refuse to acknowledge. Speed and altitude can be a weapon too, if you know how to use them. By the time the sun burns through the fog, the L-4 is no longer just a spotter plane. It is something new, something the Army never planned. America's first airborne tank killer. Arracourt was not supposed to be a decisive battlefield. On maps, it looked like quiet farmland, rolling fields, thin hedgerows, clusters of orchards, and shallow valleys shaped by centuries of plowing. But to an airman like Carpenter, those gentle curves were something else entirely. Funnels, blind corners, natural kill zones. And on that September morning, German commanders believed they could use the terrain better than the Americans. They pushed their Panther tanks through the fog, confident the long-barreled 75mm gun could tear apart any Sherman before it was even spotted. They were right at first. American tankers described the battles as shots from ghosts. Panthers emerged from the mist, fired, and vanished again. Entire platoons were erased before they could react. But the Germans had overlooked one thing. Someone above them was watching. Major Carpenter had spent weeks flying at treetop height, mapping every ridge and fold of the ground. He knew which hilltops cast shadows at sunrise. He knew which fields could hide a tank column and which ones trapped it. And more importantly, he understood what the Panther crews could not see, anything above them. From the cockpit of his L-4, he noticed patterns. When Panthers advanced through low fog, they relied on narrow corridors, routes he could predict. He realized the Panthers' greatest advantage, their killing range, became useless if the threat came from the one angle they could never armor, straight down. The bazooka modification wasn't insanity. It was geometry. A Panther could shrug off shells from a Sherman, but not a rocket striking the thin plating on its engine deck. Carpenter knew if he could descend fast enough, release a salvo, and climb out before the Germans reacted, he could strike where no tank could defend. Still, the risk was enormous. One hit from a machine gun, even a burst of small arms fire, would rip the L-4 apart. His plane would burn like paper. But Carpenter had already decided something most soldiers never admit. If calculated madness saves lives, it isn't madness at all. And as the fog began to thin, he heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the grinding advance of German armor. The ambush wasn't being set against him. It was being set for him. Carpenter lifted off from the meadow that served as his improvised runway, the L-4's tiny engine buzzing like an irritated wasp. 6 bazookas, even empty, pulled the wings slightly downward, making the aircraft feel heavier, more tense, as if it understood the insanity of its new purpose. The fog was lifting in torn sheets, revealing fractured glimpses of the battlefield. Dark shapes moved along the hedgerows, German Panthers, advancing toward the American armored line that was still repositioning. Carpenter throttled up and skimmed the treetops, watching the patterns beneath him align with a mental map he'd studied all week. Then he saw it, a column of Panthers creeping along a shallow ridge, exposed at the top without knowing it. They were hunting Shermans. They never looked up. Carpenter banked left, pressed his foot hard on the rudder, and positioned the Grasshopper directly above them. The bazookas were wired to a crude electrical switch, a trigger improvised from spare parts and stubborn confidence. Everything about this attack depended on velocity, timing, and luck. If the rockets misfired, he would die. If he misjudged the angle, he would die. If he pulled up too late, he would die. He pushed the stick forward. The L-4 plunged into a steep dive, engine screaming, airframe trembling so hard he thought the fabric might tear loose. Carpenter's eyes locked on the lead Panther, aiming not at its turret, but at the square of vulnerable plating behind it, the engine deck. At 80 feet, he squeezed the switch. 6 rockets streaked from the wings in 2 tight salvos, white smoke curling behind them like twin serpents. The Panthers were slow to react. One gunner fired a frantic burst that missed by whole yards. 2 rockets struck the first tank, one bouncing off harmlessly, the other punching straight down through the grates. A plume of fire erupted from the rear of the Panther. The commander barely had time to climb out before flames swallowed the hull. Carpenter yanked back hard on the stick. The L-4 shuddered, groaned, and clawed upward just above the treetops, escaping his machine gun rounds stitched the air behind him. Behind him, the burning Panther lit the fog from within, a fiery silhouette marking the moment a new kind of warfare had arrived. Carpenter exhaled only one sentence. It works. Carpenter didn't return to base. He couldn't. Not with what he'd just seen. Not with the Panthers still pushing toward the American lines. The first kill had confirmed what he'd suspected for weeks. Altitude, patience, and surprise could turn a slow canvas airplane into a precision strike weapon. He banked wide, circling low over an orchard where the leaves trembled from the shock of distant artillery. Panthers rarely traveled alone, and Carpenter knew the burning wreck behind him would draw attention. German commanders would be scanning fields and ridge lines for Sherman tanks, not for an L-4 barely larger than a training glider. Below him, the second Panther in the column halted, turret rotating cautiously as the crew searched for an enemy that fit their expectations. They had no idea the threat had already passed over once, and was now looping back like a hawk. Carpenter reloaded the bazookas in midair. It was a clumsy process, one hand flying the plane, the other working the manual lever wired to each rocket tube. But this was what he had practiced on quiet days, imagining how to make the L-4 fight like something it was never designed to be. He lined up the next attack run. This time the Germans were alert. A burst of machine gun fire lanced upward, the tracers climbing toward him like fiery ropes. Carpenter dipped his wings sharply, letting the rounds pass beneath the fuselage, then pushed into another dive. The Panther's roof filled his view. Carpenter triggered a pair of rockets. One veered off and exploded uselessly in a field. The other slammed into the rear armor with a hollow crack, followed by a bloom of black smoke. The tank lurched forward, then stopped, its engine dead. The German crew bailed out immediately, scrambling over the hull as Carpenter pulled away. He didn't watch them long. Their survival was irrelevant to the battle. What mattered was that another Panther had been taken out before it could kill more Americans. As he climbed back toward cloud level, Carpenter understood that this moment wasn't an accident or a stunt or luck. It was repeatable. He whispered to himself, not out of pride, but urgency. If I can do this, every L-4 can. And somewhere below, shaken German radio operators were reporting a phenomenon they didn't understand. An American spotter plane that hunted tanks. By midday, Arracourt was a battlefield of clashing eras. Panthers built for long-range duels, struggling through fog that turned their strengths into liabilities, while American tankers improvised defenses among orchards and farm walls. But above them, moving like a ghost between layers of mist, Carpenter and his modified L-4 were reshaping the fight in ways no tactician had predicted. After crippling his second Panther, Carpenter radioed back a calm message. "Tell the tankers to keep pushing. I'm still hunting." The ground crews didn't understand at first. For pilots didn't hunt. They spotted, they marked, they stayed alive by staying invisible. But the reports filtering in, from tank commanders, from artillery observers, from infantry who swore they saw rockets fall from a tiny plane, began to form a rumor that spread faster than the German armor. Somewhere over the battlefield, a pilot had turned an observation aircraft into an attack craft. The 4th Armored Division's forward units started scanning the sky between bursts of combat, searching for the little grasshopper they knew so well. Whenever they saw it, flying low and fast with smoke streaks trailing from its wings, morale surged. Men who minutes earlier thought they were outmatched suddenly realized they were not fighting alone. But the Germans felt something else entirely. Radio intercepts later revealed confusion in the Panther battalions. Crews reported a small American plane firing rockets, a description that made no sense to their commanders. The Luftwaffe liaison officer dismissed it as battlefield panic. No aircraft that slow could carry weapons, let alone approach armored units without being shot down. Yet the wrecked Panthers told a different story. Meanwhile, Carpenter didn't stop moving. He flew nap of the earth, weaving through tree lines and climbing only long enough to survey the next engagement zone. His hands were trembling from the exertion of the dives, the G-forces, and the near misses, but his voice stayed level. He wasn't acting on adrenaline. He was acting on pattern recognition, on hours of studying how Panthers deployed when they thought no one could see them. As he crossed into another valley, he spotted something that made him tighten his grip on the stick. A new group of German tanks maneuvering together, trying to flank the American line. More prey, but also more defenses. This would be the hardest run yet. The German flanking force moved with discipline. 3 Panthers up front, 2 assault guns behind, and infantry riding on the hulls. This wasn't a probing attack. It was a coordinated thrust meant to punch through the thin American line and roll up the artillery positions behind it. If they succeeded, the Battle of Arracourt could tilt in Germany's favor before nightfall. Carpenter banked high above them, hidden by drifting patches of fog. He studied their spacing, their formation, the way the lead Panther paused at each rise in the terrain. These are not green crews. These were veterans who knew how to use the land as well as any American. A frontal dive would get him killed. A shallow glide would miss the weak armor. And if he hesitated, the German force would break through and hit the artillery batteries, turning the entire sector into a slaughterhouse. He made his decision. Carpenter cut throttle, letting the L-4 sink quietly into the mist like a leaf falling through morning air. The bazooka tubes rattled against the wing struts, their remaining rockets loaded and ready. He adjusted the trim by feel alone. He could barely see 100 feet ahead. Below him, the outlines of the Panthers emerged as dark shapes pushing through the fog. Carpenter angled the Grasshopper behind them, approaching from the rear where their armor thinned and their attention pointed forward. Infantry spotted him first. One soldier shouted, pointing upward, but by then the L-4 was already diving. He released 2 rockets. Both streaked downward in clean arcs, disappearing into the fog just as the L-4 roared past the treetops. A split second later, a blast erupted beneath the mist. When Carpenter leveled out, he glanced back to see one Panther stop cold, black smoke spewing from its vents. Figures scrambled from the hatches, silhouetted by the flames. But now the Germans understood what they were facing. Machine guns opened up from multiple directions. Tracers zipped past the wings, crossing the sky like fiery needles. Carpenter threw the L-4 into an evasive climb, feeling the fabric shudder as rounds tore through the air behind him. He wasn't safe, not even close. The remaining Panthers were turning. Their commanders were no longer confused. They were hunting him now, and Carpenter, sweating, breath tight in his chest, realized something he had been trying not to admit. He had enough rockets left for one more strike. Only one. Everything would come down to that final shot. Carpenter climbed hard into the thinning fog, breath sharp in his ears, every muscle in his hands locked on the controls. Below him, the battlefield had changed. The Germans were no longer rushing forward. They were spreading out, angling their turrets upward, searching for the threat that had humiliated them twice in one morning. A tiny canvas aircraft, firing infantry rockets, had stalled their flanking attack. It was unthinkable, and the Germans refused to let it happen again. Carpenter leveled off at barely 500 feet, his heartbeat finally slowing enough for him to take stock. 3 bazookas on each wing, 6 tubes total. He had fired 5 rockets. That meant one remained, tucked under the right strut, the last sting of a creature that should never have had fangs in the first place. He scanned the battlefield through the haze. A damaged Panther burned in the orchard. Another lay crippled in the ditch from his earlier attack. That left at least 2 Panthers still operational, the most dangerous part of the flanking force. There, to the north, 2 shapes crawled along a hedgerow, moving with deliberate caution. Their commanders were no longer confident predators. They were wary, scanning the sky every few seconds. They had adapted. They were learning. The window for surprise was closing. Carpenter knew he couldn't dive both. He couldn't even disable both. He would get one chance on one tank with 1 rocket. But which? If he took the lead Panther, he might stall the advance. If he struck the second, he might create a bottleneck that trapped them both. He studied their movement carefully, angles, spacing, timing, and then he saw it, a small rise in the terrain ahead of them. The second Panther would climb it first, silhouetting its engine deck for a brief, perfect moment. A vulnerability measured in seconds. Carpenter pushed the stick forward. The Grasshopper dipped into a smooth glide, silent except for the propeller's low whir. Fog curled around the wing struts. The last bazooka tube lined up with the target as if drawn toward it. At 100 feet, he steadied the aircraft. At 80 feet, he exhaled. At 60 feet, he squeezed the trigger. The final rocket blasted free. It arced downward in a long, bright streak and disappeared behind the Panther's rising hull. A heartbeat, then another. A blast lit the hedgerow. The tank jerked violently, smoke bursting from its engine hatch. Its tracks halted mid-turn, metal grinding. The crew scrambled out in panic. Carpenter pulled up hard, climbing into the fog as the remaining Panther fired wildly into the sky. Too late, firing at shadows. He had used his last weapon, but he had also broken the German flanking attempt apart, piece by piece. Now the battlefield belonged to someone else. For the first time that day, Carpenter allowed himself to circle high above the fighting. His rockets were gone. His options were gone. But his presence wasn't. And on this battlefield, that mattered. Below him, the German flanking force, once a disciplined formation built to punch straight through the American lines, was now a scattering of damaged armor and confused infantry. The sudden loss of 3 Panthers and the inexplicable air attack disrupted their cohesion. Commanders shouted contradictory orders. Gunners spun turrets at ghosts. Infantry huddled behind hulls, unsure whether the tiny speck above them still carried more rockets. Fear, not rockets, was now Carpenter's weapon. Meanwhile, the American lines responded with ruthless efficiency. The 4th Armored Division had been waiting for a moment, any moment, when German momentum faltered. Now they saw their opening. Sherman tanks surged forward from concealed positions, exploiting gaps created by Carpenter's attacks. Artillery crews adjusted fire, hammering the forward German elements that no longer had armored cover. Carpenter could hear the shift through the radio net. Tank commanders speaking with renewed confidence. Artillery observers reporting Panthers in retreat. Infantry spotting German crews abandoning vehicles and scrambling for cover. He banked the L-4 and descended low enough to mark targets, weaving through tracer fire that now came sporadically and without coordination. Whenever he dipped a wing toward a surviving German vehicle, American gunners opened up instantly, following his signal. His Grasshopper, unarmed now, defenseless as ever, still controlled the battle like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Through breaks in the fog, Carpenter watched the remaining Panther from the flanking group turn away, retreating toward the east. It wasn't regrouping, it was fleeing. The aura of invincibility the Panthers once held had cracked, not from a superior tank, but from a canvas airplane whose total firepower weighed less than one German shell. The shift in momentum was unmistakable. Arracourt was no longer a battlefield dominated by German initiative. It was now an American counterattack fueled by improvisation, coordination, and the boldness of a pilot who refused to accept the role the manuals had given him. The tide of the day was turning, but Carpenter's story wasn't finished, not even close. As the American counterattack surged, Carpenter guided the L-4 through the shifting fog bands, marking retreating Panthers, pointing tank destroyers toward stragglers, and directing infantry to pockets of resistance. He had no rockets left, no offensive power at all, but the German units didn't know that, and Carpenter used that uncertainty like a weapon. Every time the L-4 appeared overhead, German crews ducked. Panthers halted mid-turn. Infantry abandoned positions. The battlefield psychology had warped. A tiny airplane now dictated the movement of armored units weighing 45 tons. It was absurd. It was unprecedented. And it was effective. Radio messages from American units reflected the shift. Mad majors overhead. Advance. L-4 circling. Panthers pulling back. He's got them rattled. Push forward. By early afternoon, pockets of German armor were isolated, out of fuel, or simply lost in the thick fog. The ambitious offensive, intended to be a decisive stroke, had devolved into scattered, unsynchronized engagements. American artillery pounded German staging areas, while Sherman crews maneuvered aggressively under the assumption that the skies belonged to them. And in a sense, they did. Word of Carpenter's airborne strikes traveled up the American chain of command at remarkable speed. Armored officers asked if more L-4s could be outfitted the same way. Some pilots, inspired by the rumor of a Grasshopper destroying Panthers, began wiring bazookas to their own wing struts without waiting for permission. A technique that didn't exist that morning, one not found in any Army field manual, was now diffusing through Patton's Third Army by whispers, urgency, and awe. Carpenter, exhausted, hands aching from hours of high-stress flying, finally turned toward his makeshift airstrip. His fuel was dangerously low. His nerves were frayed. His ears still rang from the near misses. But as he approached the field, he saw a crowd gathering. Mechanics, artillery observers, infantrymen, and tankers, watching the little Grasshopper wobble in toward landing. Some cheered. Some stared in disbelief. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of the crews saved, of the Panthers stopped, of the idea that had proven itself in fire and fog. His landing gear bounced once on the uneven turf, then rolled to a stop. The battlefield had quieted, but Carpenter's story was about to travel far beyond it. In the hours that followed, American ground commanders pieced together what had happened. Reports confirmed the numbers. 6 Panthers destroyed or disabled in a single day. 3 by Carpenter's rockets. Others indirectly through the chaos his attacks caused. More importantly, an entire German flanking maneuver had been broken before it reached the American lines. What Carpenter had done with a fabric-covered observation plane bordered on military heresy. He had violated regulations, ignored doctrine, and modified an aircraft in a way no manual even imagined possible. And yet the outcome was undeniable. Dozens of American tankers survived because of it. When headquarters finally contacted him, the first question was not reprimand. It was curiosity. How did you make it work? What altitude? What angle? What fuse setting? How fast can we get other planes equipped? In the days that followed, L-4 pilots across the sector began mounting bazookas to their wing struts. Some copied his wiring, others improved it. The idea spread organically, pilot to pilot, faster than the command structure could formalize it. Though no official doctrine existed, an unofficial one emerged. Use speed, use surprise, strike from above. And quietly, without anyone fully realizing it. The principles Carpenter proved at Arracourt began shaping the thinking of a future generation of aviators. Decades later, when attack helicopter doctrine formalized concepts like diving attacks, terrain masking, and rapid pop-up strikes on armor, old pilots would remember that these ideas had a roots in improvisation, born from a canvas airplane and 6 bazookas welded to its wings. As for the Germans, Panther crews developed a nickname that spread through their lines. Der verrückte Major, the Mad Major. It wasn't said with mockery. It was said with respect and fear. Carpenter himself never cared for the legend. He cared about the men he saved, the tanks he stopped, and the fact that in a moment when the manuals failed, creativity did not. On September 20th, 1944, in a fog-covered battlefield near Arracourt, a pilot refused to stay inside the lines drawn for him. And in doing so, he reshaped not just a single engagement, but the logic of aerial warfare itself. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper was never meant to be a weapon, until one man made it one.